Hello, good evening, welcome to UPfront. My name is Raymond Acquah. Now, since December 5, 2022, when Ghana announced that it was inviting eligible bondholders to exchange some 137 billion cedis of some domestic bonds for a package of new bonds, a lot has been said about what should be the actual implications and impact of this debt exchange program on you, the people out there. This program is part of a more comprehensive agenda to restore debt sustainability and get the IMF deal. Upon massive pressure from Labour, government made further amendments to the terms of the debt exchange program, including the inclusion of individual bondholders and excluding pension funds, and also the extension of the expiration date to Monday, 16 January 2022, and the settlement date for the invitation expected to occur on Tuesday, 24th of January 2023. Tonight, the mass rejection of the inclusion of individual bondholders is already kicking in. Some distinguished academics and finance experts have investigated and produced a report on the actual impact of the debt exchange program, and they'll be joining us on UPfront today to lay it bare. That is the crux of our engagement. Joining me to answer all your key questions on the impact, but more importantly, we'll be answering that ultimate question: why Ghana's proposed domestic debt exchange program is worse than a 100% haircut on principal. We are lucky to have the gentleman who authored this all-important document joining us electronically. From Canada, Assistant Professor of Economics Dennis Nsafua from the College of Business Administration in the Niagara University. Also joining us from Australia is Professor Elik Plim Abloyo, who is an Associate Professor at the Department of Finance here at the University of Ghana Business School. Gentlemen, you're welcome to UPfront. I'll start with you, Professor Abloyo. Yes, I guess I've heard. Yes, professors, let me start with you, Professor Abloyo. For many people, they are already afraid of what's happening with this debt exchange program. Today, we are hearing the massive call on them by pensioners and others who are afraid that this inclusion of individual bondholders is going to be problematic. But let's take a step back. Before this debt exchange program even kicks in, there's a lot of conversation about the value of investor bonds and the changes that's happened to it. Exactly what had happened to the value of investor bonds prior to this debt exchange coming on board.
Okay, thank you, Raymond, for the question. So typically, we know that there's an inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates. So when interest rates are going up, we see that bond prices fall. And consequently, the value of these bonds have already been declining on the secondary exchange, that is the Ghana fixed income market. And basically, the rationale is that so for example, assume you bought a bond with a coupon rate of 20%, but now interest rates in the market are about, let's say, 50%. Okay, what that means is that your current bond is only giving you 20%, but new bonds in the market are offering 50%. And consequently, when you want to sell your bond in the market, you can't sell it for its face value. Okay, its price would have to come down so that somebody will be willing to buy it. So these prices have already been falling, and it's in line with what investors have experienced, what we call the mark-to-market. Okay, as the price of the bonds fall, then, for example, if you hold a mutual fund, the money in the mutual fund will also decrease. So in general, I'll say that the prices of the bonds have been falling, and significantly because of the very significant increase in interest rates.
That's actually pushing people in the wrong direction. But let me bring Professor Dennis Nsafua into the conversation. You are welcome also, Prof. Is there an estimation of the decline in my value of investment prior to even the conversation about debt exchange? Because we heard of mark-to-market. We heard of all the other changes in the market related to this.
All right. Thank you, Raymond, for the question. Before I even go into the details of your question, I want to issue out a disclaimer. I want your viewers to know that whatever we say here is in no way a financial advice. We are purely academics, and then everything we have done and we would share is purely for academic purposes, and it should not be constrained for and advised to either accept or reject the offer presented by the government. Now that out of the way, let me go straight into your question. As earlier explained, anytime interest rate increases, the price of a bond decreases. From the analysis we did, we were fortunate to have access to a bond certificate. We used that bond certificate as an indicative bond, and then we analyzed how much that unique bond has decreased in its price. So what we call the rate of capital gain. When we estimated that particular bond, we saw that the rate of capital gain had declined by about 63%. So on a whole, even before the debt exchange kicks in, the holder of the bond we analyzed would have approximately lost about 63% of the value of that bond.
So, I mean, so how was that? I'm sure it was a conversation that was happening in the country about people's hearing and saying that they've had some reduction in the amount of money they kept with the various units and they didn't understand what was really happening. Is that what accounted for what was really happening to the money before even the main conversation about debt exchange started?
Well, when it comes to market activities, so many things influence it. Obviously, I wouldn't rule out the demand to withdraw money from the market as part of the reasons why the price of the bond kept falling. But another reason is also because of general increases in interest rate. Throughout the period of 2022, we saw the Bank of Ghana persistently increase the policy rate. Obviously, if the policy rate is going up, every other interest rate along the yield curve would move in the same direction. So it is a combination of different factors. It's a combination of people trying to cash out their money from the market, and then it's also a combination of policy decisions in line with interest rate hikes.
Would that have been a wonderful time for anybody to go chase his money, even though there was some form of depreciation in value of the money? Would that have been a perfect time for anybody to go say that I'm cashing out?
Well, the decision to cash out is individual specific. Like I said, you have to evaluate your position and then your need for that money. Some people would find value in cashing out, obviously, but I don't think that cuts across every investor. Some investors would be in a better position waiting if they don't have urgent need for their money. That's what I think.
I mean, I'm asking you this question because you're an economist. Inflation targeting has been a policy in this country for a very long time. There is no way that the central bank would have been sitting there when inflation, as we speak today, is even inched up to almost 54%, to not use hiking up prime rate as a way of targeting inflation. They did do the magic that was required. We see inflation still inching up.
This question is actually an empirical question. And it is very difficult to answer that question just purely by looking at where inflation is and looking at where interest rate is. I know the CPI number that came out today was around 54%. I stand to be corrected.
That's it.
And we know that the Bank of Ghana has been increasing interest rate. Okay, so one good question someone would ask is, if the Bank of Ghana has been increasing interest rate and CPI persistently increase, are they achieving the objective? Well, it is difficult to say because we don't know the counterfactual. What I mean by counterfactual is, you ask yourself, if Bank of Ghana had not increased interest rate, where would the CPI have been, right? Even with the increase in interest rate, which everybody understands in some way slows down demand and then tries to reduce the excess demand in the system and also try to cool down inflation, we have seen inflation persist, right? I personally believe that in the absence of the hikes in the policy rate, I think that inflation would have been worse off than it is today. So I haven't done the empirical work. I don't know the exact number of how much inflation would have been in the absence of the interest rate, but I think that the interest rate to some degree have helped us achieve an inflation of 54%. As ironic as it sounds.
That's interesting. But if you just joined us, this is Upfront. Our conversation tonight is to be able to answer that ultimate question. That question is about whether or not a haircut of 100% on your principal compared to the current debt exchange program with all the mass revolts and opposition to it would have been a better option. These gentlemen that I'm speaking to, they have a research paper properly done, procedure followed, which is trying to tell us why Ghana's program is worse than a 100% haircut on your principal. And we actually started the conversation of looking at what happened to your investments prior to even the discussion about the domestic debt exchange. And they've been telling us that some level of massive devaluation happened to it. Over 60 or so percent they have mentioned in this conversation. Yeah. Now, I want us to move in the direction of what happened with the introduction of our debt exchange program. December 5, something happened. We told the people of this republic the very inclusions and exclusions we're looking at and the voluntary nature of this particular program. But what would have been the impact of that December 5 proposal on the bonds? We know that was amended later on. But assuming it was what it was, what would have been the impact of that particular proposal with the hope that we can compare it to this current one? Let me start with you, Professor Abloyo.
Okay, Raymond, thank you so much. Maybe I would also comment briefly on the previous question.
Okay.
Okay, so as Dennis said, we are not giving investment advice or we're not recommending what investors should do. But sometimes, depending on what is happening in the market, even when prices are falling, it may actually be a good time to buy. Okay, because prices have, let me say, reached the bottom and may increase subsequently. Okay, so having said that, what we did was that we took what we call an indicative bond. We obtained a bond certificate. I'll give you the details of the bond. So the coupon rate on the bond was 19.5% based on the bond contract. In terms of coupon compound payment, it was done semi-annually, so that means twice a year. The yield to maturity on the bond was 50%. We took this from the Ghana fixed income market, given that we're estimating the value for a 15-year bond. That was the rate we obtained as of December 2022. Now, the yield to maturity on the bond at the time of purchase, which was in 2020, was 18.5%. The remaining maturity of this bond, it was a 10-year bond, but as of today, it has about 5 years to maturity. The bond matures in October 2027. Its face value is about 1.1 million, and then the purchase price of the bond as at the settlement date was 1.2 million. So this is a bond that we obtained. Now, on the 5th of December, the government announced certain terms. So the coupon rate in 2023 would have been 0%. 2024 was 5%. Okay, which will be paid twice a year. So that will be 2.5% every 6 months. And then from 2025, the coupon payment was 10%, which is 5% semi-annually. Okay, so these are the terms that the government announced. The government also announced what we call a debt exchange consideration ratio. Okay, so this was supposed to be 17% for the 2027 bond, another 17% for the 2029 bond, 25% for the 2032 bond, and then you also had 41% for the 2037 bond. So what we then did was that so the bond price originally was 1.2 million. As of the time that the government announced the debt exchange program, the price of this bond had fallen to about 441,000 Ghana cedis. Okay, so that tells you the massive decline in the price of the bond. So from about 1.2 million in 2020, the current price of this bond would be about 441,000 Ghana cedis. Now, what we did was that we then considered that if an investor had exchanged this old bond for the new bond offered by the government, what would be the price of the bond? Okay. In particular, what would be the price of the 4 new bonds? So we computed the price for the 2027 bond. We computed the price for the 2029 bond. We also computed the price for the 2032 bond, and finally the 2037 bond. Okay, so we actually did the cash flow projections and then discounted these coupon payments and principal repayments using the yield to maturity of 50%. Now, what we see or what we find is that the price of the bond at the time of the 5th December announcement should have been about 123,000 Ghana cedis. Okay. So remember that before the announcement, it was about 441,000 cedis. After the announcement, the price or the fair market value should have been around 123,000 Ghana cedis, which represents a 72% decline in the value of the bond.
That's interesting. If I hear you properly, if you have gone ahead with the original plan, inclusions and all the things we said, the one that was announced on December 5 last year, it would have actually led to a whopping 72% being removed or wiped off the remaining value of the bond.
Yes, that's what our analysis suggests.
What really does this mean? That people have been extremely worse off?
Okay, so I guess people can conclude for themselves. Okay, but what the data tells us is that the fair market value of the bond would have declined by about 72%.
Okay.
So again, like Dennis said, we are not making a recommendation as to whether you should accept this offer or not. You would need to consult your financial and legal advisors. But our empirical analysis suggests that the value of the bond would have dropped by about 72%.
Okay. So, I mean, you were talking about the exact, I needed to go over that. You did some brief analysis about how you got there. I think people need to understand that you actually compare the value of the bond prior to the introduction and what the impact of that December 5 arrangement would have had on it. That point's what I needed to reiterate for people to get clear.
Okay, so what we did was that the government said, okay, we'll pay coupons of 0% in 2023. So we modeled, I'm also able to share my screen if that is possible. So we modeled that. We took the 2027 bond. In 2023, the coupon payment was 0. Then in 2024, the coupon payment was 5%, so we split that into 2 because it's semi-annual. Okay. Then from 2025, the coupon payment given was 10%. So again, because it's paid semi-annually, we split that into 2. Then we use the principal as 17% of the face value of the bond, which was the exchange ratio for the 2027 bond. So you are able to actually project the cash flows. We did that in Excel. And once we projected the cash flows, we discounted them using the yield to maturity of 50%. And
that's what yielded this particular 72% reduction in the value of the bond.
In the value of the bond, yes.
Now, the exact question would have been, of course, there were some variations down to that particular December 5 proposal, which is the current one that we are using. The December 24th, of course, eve of Christmas proposal. That proposal, how does it compare to the original one that was introduced on December 5?
Okay, I think I'll allow Dennis to answer this one.
Okay, yes, let me bring in Dr. Safwa, yes. So the question I'm asking here is, of course, we now know that if we had gone ahead and used the December proposal, bonds would have seen a reduction in value up to 72%. If you now compare it to what we currently have in operation, that is the December 24 second one, which sought to remove the participation possibilities of the pension funds and include individual bonds. How does it look like? What's the value of bonds within that spectrum?
Okay. In the spirit of Christmas, I think the government decided to give Ghanaians, especially investors and bondholders, some Christmas gifts. The 24th December proposal was slightly a better offer than the 5th December proposal. In earlier submission, he made a point that the 5th December would have wiped off roughly 72% of the value of the bond. With the 24th December proposal, we observed that for that particular indicative bond, which we analyzed, I have to stress that because every bond could have been different, right? The particular bond which we analyzed, the 24th December reduced the value of the bond by roughly 66%. So then it means that we moved from 72% loss in valuation to 66%, which is slightly an improvement of the 5th December valuation of the bond. Now I have to explain why that differences came about. In the 5th December proposal, the government was replacing the existing bond with 4 new bonds. And each of these 4 new bonds had some exchange ratios, 17%, 17%. And then we had the 2037, which was the last time principal will be paid, was around 41%. In the new proposal, the proposal of 24th December, Christmas Eve, the government was replacing the bonds with 12 additional bonds. And these 12 new bonds had some being 9% in terms of the exchange consideration ratios. And then later on, it reduces to 8%. We observed that the cash flow of the new proposal at the earlier years were higher than the cash flows of the old proposal in the earlier years. Specifically speaking, about 41% of principal would have been paid in 2037 for the 5th December proposal, but 2037 and 2038 combined in the 24th December proposal would only have roughly 16% of the principal being paid. So you can see that less is being paid at a later date in the 24th December, and more is being paid at a later date in the 5th December proposal. Now, with discounting, the further you pay, the worse it is. A dollar today is always better than a dollar tomorrow. That is what accounted for the significant difference in the two proposals.
That's interesting. Now, this is being thorny. It's a big conversation happening in the Republic of Ghana. Not only because whichever proposal was given, there's been some people who are opposed and threatened. And of course, Labour, for example, mounted a very massive opposition to the December 5th one, which led to some of the amendments that we saw today, the exclusion of pension funds and its related ones. The other point that's being made there is that even today, whilst your modeling suggests that the value of the bonds appear to be a little bit better off than under the previous arrangement, there is massive opposition from people who are, even some of them, threatening suicide over the fact that they are going to lose a lot in the process. Now, if you do the calculations, there's a question that I need to bring up here. How does the debt exchange proposal compare to a haircut? If you put the two, if you put the current one as against a haircut, let's say a haircut 100% on principal, how does it compare to it? Yes, Pastor Abloyo.
Okay, so Raymond, thank you very much. So what we decided to do, again, as an empirical experiment, was to see that, okay, this proposal, how does it actually compare to a haircut on principal? Let me be specific. Okay, so how does this compare to a haircut on principal? So we started with, okay, a 20% haircut, 50%, 80%. Then we actually wiped off all the principal. Okay, so what we saw was that even if the government had done a 100% haircut, that would have been better than the current proposal it has offered to investors. And let me explain again a bit further. So we took this old bond, looked at its coupon payments and principal repayment, which is upon maturity in 2027. We changed that principal payment to 0. Okay, meaning that the government will not pay any principal to investors, and that the investors will only receive a coupon payment. When we did this analysis, we realized that the bond, given the cash flows or the coupon payments, would have declined to about 350,000 Ghana cedis. So remember that for the first proposal on December 5th, the value of the bond declined from about 441,000 cedis to, that was how much? I think 123,000 Ghana cedis for December 5th. For 24th December, the value of the bond would have declined from, again, 441,000 Ghana cedis thereabouts to about 147,000 Ghana cedis. Okay, so we are talking about the current proposal. That is, the bond value would have declined by about 66%. Okay, now we are seeing, or the data is telling us that if the government had done 100% haircut on principal, what that will mean is that the value of the bond would then drop from about 441,000 Ghana cedis to 350,000 Ghana cedis. So you can do the comparison. And this represents a 21% loss in present value terms of the value of the bond.
So if I understood you properly, if government had gone by the December 5th proposal, there would have been some 72% value loss. If the government, since the government made the amendments and pushed it to the December 24th proposal, the second one that's currently in operation, it surely will lead or in the range of some 66% loss. What you are saying is that if the government had done a 100% what they call it, haircut on principal, instead of the current debt exchange program, we are looking at some 21% loss. That is what you're saying?
Yes, exactly what we are saying.
What would have accounted for that?
Okay, so again, let me explain. The value of any asset in finance is what we call the present value of the underlying cash flows. Okay, in the case of a bond, the underlying cash flows are the coupon payments or the interest payments which are paid twice a year, and the return of the face value upon maturity. Okay, so if you want to find the value of your bond, or even a bond that trades in the secondary market, is a discounting process. We bring all those cash flows into today's money. Okay, so that is exactly what we did. We forecasted the coupon payments on this bond from 2023 to 2027, okay, assuming that the government did not change maturity. So that is important. So the maturity of the bond will still have been 2027. The coupon payment of the bond will still have been, if you remember, I said 19.5%. Okay, so here we are assuming that there was no change in maturity, no change in coupon payment, and that the only debt operation undertaken by the government would have been a haircut, in this case, a 100% haircut. Okay, and our findings indicate that if this was the case, the value of the bond would have declined by about 21%. But let me also add that it's ultimately a numbers game. Okay, when I say it's a numbers game, what I mean is that the government is looking at achieving a certain debt level. Okay, maybe their estimation, they needed to do this size of, let me say, a debt operation such that the debt will be sustainable. But what we are seeing from the data is that if they had done a 100% haircut, then the value of the bond would have declined by about 21%.
Now, if they had done, let's say, the haircut you proposed, are we likely to cover the 137 billion that was originally the intended amount to be exchanged?
Okay, so that is not an analysis that we have done. I don't know if Dennis wants to comment on that. Okay,
so Dr. Acquah, the question I'm asking is, government has an intention, debt sustainability. Would we have been able to achieve the same debt sustainability if we had done the haircut 100% on principal that you talk about?
Empirically, we haven't done that, as Ellie said, but I strongly doubt that if the government had gone on that route, they would have achieved their objective. I think we should understand what problem each economic agent is trying to solve here. The investor has his own economic problem trying to solve. The investor is trying to maximize his return from holding the bond. Now, the government is trying to solve a problem of debt sustainability. Okay, so there is always going to be a friction. The reason is because the objective of the government seems to be contradicting the objective of the investor. So I strongly believe that if the government yields to the investor, the government will not be able to achieve its objective. And going back to the previous question on the difference between the new bond, which Ellie mentioned, I would like to also point out that we did the analysis of how much principal is needed, principal haircut is needed compared to the new proposal, that is the 24th proposal, where we analyzed that about 21% of the bond value would have been lost with a 100% haircut. Well, that was motivated purely from the fact that the government has marketed this DDE as one that embed no haircut on the principal. In as much as that is true, indeed it is true, it doesn't embed any haircut on the principal. Our point we want to send across is that it is not better than having a haircut on the principal. What the government is giving us is indeed true. They are not taking any haircut on the principal, but it may be worse off than if the government had decided to take a haircut.
That's an interesting point. So you are basically saying that what government gave as perhaps the biggest way of comforting people, that you are not losing a peso off your principal, it's not necessarily a better alternative to what the current program really is, if that's what I understood you is proper.
Exactly. That's the exact point.
Brilliant. Yes.
They were truthful.
Please, yeah, you're explaining.
They were truthful in saying that they are not touching the principals. Indeed, they are not touching principals. But what they offered is worse than had they touched the principal.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Now, the question I asked previously, which was to do with meeting the intentions that are within it, within the conversation, the main changes that happened was removing the pension funds as the possible assets and extending some way the engagements involved. Now, if you ask the people who are currently complaining, they believe that any attempt to touch individual bonds is extremely problematic too. And to them, it is having to some of them, committing suicide, and that they will not even be able to meet their medical expenses and all the other things that are relevant to them. Are their concerns that legitimate?
Their concerns is more than legitimate. Ghana is in a very difficult situation. Like I mentioned earlier, investors are regular people, humans that have bills to pay. They have families to feed. They have school fees to pay, right? So they have obtained some bonds. They are reliant on the cash flow they receive on these bonds to meet their obligations. So from their point of view, they want to get as much as possible from the government because, honestly speaking, it's their money, all right? However, the country or the government of Ghana happened to find itself in an extremely difficult position. The government is unable to pay its debts. So the government needs to find a way back to a position where it will be able to pay its debt. So to the government is trying all ways and means to be able to achieve that objective without considering necessarily or specifically individual specific needs. To the government, they are boxing everybody as part of the debt. Okay, this is the total debt we have. This is the route we need to achieve debt sustainability. Let's go through that route.
Now, that's an interesting point. Yes, forgive me, but I sense that I could bring in Professor Abloyo. You wanted to make a point.
Yes, I wanted to. So what I would say is that, if you remember, even before these discussions began, we did a paper and And I argue that in any debt exchange program, individual investors should be exempted.
Yes, that's what you say.
And yes. And the main reason is that individual investors are usually more vulnerable, okay, compared to, let me say, a financial institution. And in addition to that, individual investors may not be able to assess any, let me say, accommodating measure that the government will put in place. So, for example, for the financial institutions, there's going to be a financial stability fund that can be accessed by financial institutions to help them cope with the debt exchange program. As I speak, I'm not aware of any similar program for individual investors. And like Dennis mentioned, some people have obligations, okay, that they have to pay: school fees, loans, even their daily survival may depend on their investments in these bonds. This may have been pensioners who have invested their money for many years, especially their life savings, okay. Such an operation will definitely affect their balance sheet. The balance sheet of any economic agent, you have its assets and also its liabilities and equity. Okay, so once your assets are reduced, it also has an impact on your net worth for your equity. Okay, so I strongly believe, even before this exchange program was announced, that individual investors should be exempted.
And what's currently happening? Can we go back on it? Because we basically did an exchange of a sort, pulling out pension funds and bringing in individual investors. Can we decide that we are pulling out individual investors too, and mindful of the vacuum that will be created? How would that be filled?
The government can decide to do whatever they want.
Okay.
It's all about all about political will.
Yeah.
But personally, I have even a much bigger concern. I think Ghana is in a bigger situation than most people can imagine. And the government would need every way possible or any help they can get. With this domestic debt sustainability, which impacts investors. On the negative side, I think the government has done so much to rehabilitate the financial sector in Ghana through the financial sector cleanup. And now it seems like they are shooting themselves at the foot. Right? You come into power, you do a whole lot to, in quotes, clean the financial sector. And then you are robbing them of what you claim you have cleaned up. That is what I see as the negative side in terms of the bigger implication on investment participation in Ghana. However, from the government's point of view, if you're a government and you have the sort of debts that a country has, you want to include every possible debt. You want to obtain as much as possible in terms of debt forgiveness that you can get. You want to amass your debt forgiveness. And that is what the government is trying to do. The government is trying to get as much as possible they can.
There's an option that's been proposed that you have almost some 27 billion in terms of capital expenditure sitting on your budget that you want to spend this year. How about taking out the individual bonds out of that? Don't touch that one, but make sure that you reduce that capital expenditure so that you don't spend that much in the area, which will mean that your debt at the end of the day will not be that much. Some are clearly saying that those are ways you show that you care for the people.
Qualitatively, I think that makes sense. But quantitatively, like I said, I haven't run the numbers. I don't know how much that would impact the government's operations and in the short term and in the long term. But qualitatively, that makes more sense. And this even brings into bear the discussion of transparency. All right? I think the government should be transparent to bondholders and then engage them, explain their position. Right? Don't cover up issues. Meet them halfway. The government should try as much as possible to show leadership and then engagement, right? From the budget 2023, we noticed that the government is increasing their expenditure by 53%.
Yeah.
Well, it is difficult for me as an individual investor to forgive you, the government, who owes me an amount of money if you are still on a big spending spree.
That's an interesting point. Now, Pops Abloyo, the question I was actually bringing up to is this reference to capital expenditure that show that you really are in a tight corner by also making some sacrifices in those areas.
Okay, thanks, Raymond. I think that's a good question. Every move of the dice has implications or trade-offs. Okay, now it depends on what type of capital expenditure, for example. And the essence of capital expenditure is to promote or fund future growth. Okay, so if you cut capital expenditure, for example, it means that we may not be investing in roads, we may not be investing in hospitals, we may not be investing in schools. Okay, so I think it's more about value for money. Okay, are you spending on things that are really worth it? Are we able to cut corruption? The National Cathedral, is it important at this time, for example? Okay, so every move of the dice has implications. Every decision has a trade-off. Okay, if you cut capital expenditure, it also has implications, even for the future growth of the country. So these are not easy times. The decisions are not very easy, but I feel like Dennis said earlier that if we're able to demonstrate to investors that we are actually cutting expenditure, we are prioritizing expenditure, then investors can say, okay, we see that the government itself is making an effort, it is taking part of the burden, it is also feeling the pain of this debt exchange program, and consequently, they can also try to sacrifice a bit to help the government achieve its debt sustainability objective.
Can we select which individual bondholders should be allowed to participate in this? Can we, mindful of what the likely implications will be like across the board, or selecting based on the need and of some form of assessment, can we say that some should be part of it, others should be excluded?
That would be very difficult to do.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
yeah, I think that would be very difficult to do, and it would also not send across clear commitment from the government to engage everybody, right?
Yeah.
How do you pick person A from person B? How do you tell person A deserves this amount of money, but person B, who equally deserves it, doesn't deserve it? I think it will be very difficult to establish that equity.
Now, when we talk about these individual bondholders, in all, how much are we looking at? How huge is the quantum that is going to make a significant difference if it's taken out of our current domestic debt exchange program?
Okay, so Raymond, maybe I'll add a bit to what Dennis said earlier. Okay, so usually you want to be equitable in the treatment of, let me say, a class of creditors. So if you take banks, for example, upon what basis do you exclude some and include others? If you take individuals, upon what basis do you include some and exclude others? I've heard some arguments in the media that pensioners, for example, should be exempted. Okay, if you take, let me say, somebody who is 60 years old, okay, how long do they even have to live in? If you take the life expectancy, okay, in Ghana, I think women is about 65 thereabout, men about 60 thereabout. Okay, so if you stretch payments to, let me say, 2038, you are more or less saying that the pensioner has to live at least up to 75 years to get something small. They are still losing a lot of money anyway. Okay, but to get something small from their lives, savings, toil, and hard work. So I've heard arguments that pensioners, for example, should be excluded. But if you exclude pensioners and you come to the working class, let me say somebody like me or somebody like Dennis, and you touch our savings or investments now, it also has an impact on us when we, for example, retire in 20 years or 30 years' time. Okay, so they are very difficult decisions to make, and I'll say that you want to treat all, especially within a class of of creditors. Okay, you want to treat all of them equitably.
The question I'm asking you is, if government removes individual bondholders, how devastating would it be to our domestic debt exchange program?
Okay, so I haven't looked at the numbers for that particular. That's a separate analysis that we want to do. I heard some numbers. I don't read it. I think about 30 billion. Dennis, do you remember?
I don't have it in mind, but it's something we are currently working on, and then in the appropriate time we would share the findings.
Yeah, so that's the next analysis we want to look at. The information is publicly available. We can.
The issue as to which yield to maturity should be used in the discounting is the issue I'll be asking a question on after this break.
Sure.
You're welcome back to UPfront. My name is Raymond Acquah. So in this conversation, I've been trying to get you to get to the bottom of this matter, the matter of Ghana's domestic debt exchange program, and two very distinguished academics who have put together a paper on why Ghana's program is worse than 100% haircut on the principal. I'm sure you recall the government said they will not touch principal. Indeed, the argument being made by the professors that if Ghana actually touched the principal, 100% of it would have been way better than the current debt exchange program, talking about how devastating the devaluation of the values of your bonds are being. First, they proposed that the first program that we put together was going to lead to some 72% reduction in the value of bonds. The second program that's currently being debated, which is including individual bondholders on board, is supposed to lead to some 66% reduction in the value of the bonds. Those are the conversations we are having with Professor Elikpili Mabloyo of the University of Ghana Business School, and also Dr. Dennis Nsafwa from the University of Nigeria. The gentlemen have been helping us understand what this means. We'll be wrapping up this conversation soon. The questions I'm actually floating is one of the questions I needed to bring aboard before we actually conclude the conversation. So in all of this, what's the implied yield to maturity or return of the new bonds? That's a question that's on the minds to many people in this country today, including even those who are opposing the individual bondholders' participation.
Okay, so again, like Dennis mentioned earlier, you have different investors who have different objectives. Okay, what we saw from the data from the Ghana fixed income market was that the yield to maturity is currently around 50%. Okay, so for investors, that is their, let me say, opportunity cost of capital. Okay. However, for the government, it's not possible or reasonable that they can continue to pay 50% for the foreseeable future. Okay, that is going to wreck the finances of the government. So what we did, again, is that we did an interest analysis and we sought to compute the implied yield to maturity on these proposed new bonds. Okay, when we say implied yield to maturity, what we mean is that we try to figure out an interest rate that would equate the price of the bond to the principal of the bond currently. Okay, so we played around this iterative process, try and error. We played around with a number of figures, and the implied yield to maturity that we arrived at for the current proposal is an average of 7.5%. Okay, so what it means is that the return on the yield that should prevail on the bond in the secondary market if it begins to trade is an average of 7.5%. I don't know if, Dennis, you want to add something. Yeah.
No, I don't have anything else to add.
You were coming in on that one, so actually made room for that. But we need to wrap up the conversation because we are already running out of time. Gentlemen, what does this mean for the person who is currently crying about involvement? Should we have chosen a haircut instead of the domestic debt exchange program? And currently, the second question, which is also very key to people, is can anything at all be done about individual bondholders who are, some of them are extremely worried about the situation?
Well, the question is even broader than you have asked. Remember that Ghana's debt is unsustainable. The government is trying to find a path to sustainability. The domestic debts exchange, the DDE program, is just one phase of it. The government has to go through the same process for the external debts. So as the government goes through its entire debt restructuring process, I think Ghanaians would also have to be considerate enough and understand the position of the government. We are in desperate times as a country. And personally, I even have a much bigger concern. I feel if the government doesn't get this debt restructuring right, we risk becoming serial debt restructurers. What that simply means is that come 2027, when the government has to pay its principal, I fear this whole process would not go accordingly and we would achieve a suboptimal debt restructuring. And the government would have to restructure again in 2027. That is personally my biggest concern. As governments engage investors, which I strongly encourage them to do, I would also wish to encourage investors to try to understand the government's position. As a whole, the country as a whole is in a big, difficult situation, which we need everybody to come on board to help the government achieve its part of the sustainability.
Pops Abloy, final words on individual bondholders.
Okay, so thank you once again. Like I said, I would wish that individual bondholders would be exempted. And the question then is that if they are exempted, the money has to come from somewhere. And the government has very difficult choices to make. And hopefully they make very good choices that, like Daniel said, provides long-term sustainability. Okay, that provides long-term sustainability for the economy and also for investors as well. For me, I think they should engage investors. If it is possible, they should exempt individual investors. And let's pray that things go very well so that we don't come back to a position where we have to restructure debt again in the future.
I am grateful to you, professors, for joining this evening's conversation and for your wonderful research work that actually brought to light that Ghana's program is worse than 100% haircut on the principal of your bonds and your very comments on individual and other bondholders. Folks, that's where we end today's edition of Upfront. Many thanks to you for joining our conversation. Tomorrow is another edition.